Thank you for the invitation to speak. Very excited to be here talking about a company that I co-founded many years ago, and we're finally coming out of stealth mode since we have great clinical data and excited to tell you about it. So we can go on to the next slide. Our company's called Levation Pharma. Levation short for elevation, because we're talking about elevating the upper eyelid, and our logo kind of reflects that with the V propping the upper eyelid up. And let's talk about that. If we can go to the next slide. I co-founded this company with Frank Litvak several years ago. Frank is a cardiologist by training. He's a serial or parallel entrepreneur. He's very well known for being one of the inventors of the drug-eluting cardiac stent, but since then has gone and done a lot of other things with many exits under his belt. I'm an ophthalmologist, have a PhD background as well, did a fellowship with Bob Langer at MIT in sustained release topical drug delivery, which ended up coming in handy for this, and spent some time at Allergan for a couple of years working in clinical development in ophthalmology and cross-pollinating with the aesthetics team just a little bit. So if we can go on to the next slide, Levation's got a world-class team of people from chemistry to regulatory to clinical and PK, and they've really done a fantastic job putting together what I'm about to show you guys today. So if we can go to the next slide. I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I talk about the upper eyelid cosmetic market being very much untapped. We know that there are over 100,000 cosmetic or aesthetic blepharoplasty surgeries performed every year in the US, many more done worldwide. Most of the patients so far are women, but there are many men who are interested in this procedure as well. But it has so far largely been a surgical market. We know from a lot of research and just talking to patients that as something that is self-administered, that would give the same effect as surgery or something close to it, would be an enormous market. And that's really what we've gone toward. If we go to the next slide, you can see that the periorbital and periocular aesthetic market is massive. We have products that are toxins, fillers, eyelash growers, and everything in between, both as RX and OTC. But there's an enormous potential still for the eyelid. Others have attempted to address it, and we'll talk about the competition a little bit later with Upneek, but we wanted an approach that is actually going to fit in to people's aesthetic routines. And necessity is also the mother of invention. As an ophthalmologist going through residency, we had an oculoplastic rotation. I was always horrible at getting the eyelids to be perfectly even. And one thing about the eyelids is if they're uneven, even by 0.5 millimeter, you can tell from across the room. And so I always try to find a way to hack things that I can't fix on my own. And this is how this product came about. And if we go to the next slide, what is our product? It's Lev 102 gel. Our indication is acquired blepharoptosis, which is just droopy lids. The product is an odorless, colorless eyeshadow primer that is compatible with eyeshadows, topical, self-administered once a day, clear, aqueous gel, which is also sterile, which is what the FDA requires, with ophthalmically accepted excipients, and we're taking a 505(b)(2) pathway. The active ingredient is oxymetazoline, the same API as in Upneek. So it activates Mueller's muscle that causes the upper eyelid to lift pharmacologically, just like adrenaline does. Next slide. We also are developing the vehicle of Lev 102 gel as an OTC, something that we can get on the market pretty much immediately. And this is a product that we have done large scale, if we go to the next slide, pilot manufacturing with a large global sterile CDMO, and this is what it will look like in a tube, just like a typical eyeshadow primer. So it would fit in to someone's aesthetic routine, swapping out for their existing eyeshadow primer, or if they're not putting eyeshadow, it goes right on and you can't tell you have it on because it absorbs right away. Now, if we go to the next slide, we completed a phase 2 trial several months ago using 3 leading sites, Dave Ward, Brian Biesman, and Steve Yolen, who many of you I'm sure know. 33 patients, placebo, low dose, and high dose. Single application, 1-day trial, because we get immediate results. And we looked in terms of efficacy at MRD1, which I'll talk about in a moment, as well as several other endpoints, including visual fields, face Q questionnaire as a patient-reported outcome. Next slide, let's talk about MRD1. MRD1 is marginal reflex distance for the upper eyelid. That refers to measuring the height between the corneal light reflex, so that's the reflection in the center of the cornea, and the height of the highest point on the upper eyelid. So you draw a straight line. We used Canfield's Aesthetic Reading Center in order to do these evaluations in an objective We don't say blinded in ophthalmic studies, we say masked manner. So they did a masked analysis with 2 independent observers. And from a clinical perspective, we used as our key endpoint for analysis a 1 millimeter or greater change from baseline in MRD1, because we know that a 1 millimeter difference is aesthetically meaningful to patients, it's functionally meaningful to patients, and you can basically tell again from across the room when someone's had that amount of change or more. Next slide. Mean age was close to 65 years, 75% were female. And on the next slide, safety and tolerability, 0 adverse events in the entire study, which is very remarkable. No ocular changes in any of the ocular vital signs like vision and eye pressure, etc. And we saw near 100% tolerability and comfort reporting. So patients really loved having this on their eyes. Many of them said that even if this is placebo, I want it. And I'm about to show you why in a moment. Next slide. This is really the key data. When we look at that responder analysis, proportion of patients who had a 1 millimeter or more change from baseline in eyelid height, we see placebo in green, light blue is the 1%, and in the dark blue is the 2%. And we see that basically at every time point, we saw lifting happening even as early as half an hour post-dose, but starting from 1 hour all the way through hour 8, we couldn't really keep them in the clinic longer than hour 8, but we can imagine this would go much longer than that. A dose proportionate response where the 2% had a really high responder rate, almost, approaching 100%, even at the later time points. 1% had a lower responder rate, and we still saw some responders in the vehicle, and we'll talk about why in just a little bit. We also did another analysis looking to see who met that endpoint in the next slide at both hour 2 and hour 6. This is because the FDA really likes us to look at both time points and see who responded twice. And so this would satisfy that. When we see that on the far right, very high responder rates, again, for that 2%, around 70% or so met that. And if we go to the next slide, let's look at some pictures of patients really quickly. This is a vehicle patient. We saw that she had a response. Why? This is someone who had very severe ptosis. This stuff, what's interesting is that as it dries, the gelling agent that forms a thin, invisible film on the upper eyelid contracts and it raises the lid. Next slide. This is another vehicle patient, no response. Next slide. 1% patient, you can see a clear response that goes at least 8 hours. Next slide. Another 1% patient, very obvious response over time. I'm almost done. Next slide here. Another patient, this is a 2%, 93-year-old woman. You can see a profound, very obvious response. She was smiling by the end of it if I were to show you her whole face. Next one is another 2% patient. Again, you see a very pronounced response, but it doesn't make her look bug-eyed like Upneek does as well. Next slide. Same thing again with another 2% patient. If we can skip to the next one, again, another 2% patient. Next slide, please. Lots of intellectual property globally with 3 issued U.S. patents. Next slide. One thing that we have as an advantage over Upneek is we get rid of the eye drop hesitance that a lot of people have, both the doctors and the patients. The eye drop delivery is uncomfortable. It's associated with disease. This fits in as an aesthetic. There's no direct exposure to the ocular surface of the drug. It's much longer acting than Upneek from what we've seen. And, patients are happy with it. And it soothes the skin. It hydrates. And that's something that people want. And it's compatible later on even with the sunscreen for the OTC, variant that has no API. So in summary, developing 2 products, a prescription for eyelid lift with an active API of oxymetazoline and a vehicle as an OTC gel, which can also provide lift, albeit a little bit less. We have great phase 2 data that supports the vehicle being an active as well. We have validated large-scale commercial manufacturing, and we're looking forward to moving forward with our pivotal study. So thank you very much.